Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Calls. This is the 2024 Sony Open Initial Research Show. That's right, we are starting off 2024 with a bang. We have a couple of shout outs to give. First off to Mama Call. That's right, Mom hit a top 5 wager for Ben on. Actually, she bet a top 10. He solo fourths. So congratulations to you on your hit. And for yours truly, the outright wagers I made were utter garbage. Luke List did play fairly well. Finishes up in the top 20, I believe. But I hit Sepp Straka as top European. He was at 10-1. If you were watching last week and especially Wednesday evening, you knew how high I was on Sepp Straka this past week at Kapalua. He ends up beating every other European in the field. So my 2024 starts off in the positive. Great way to start the new year with a winning week, a winning wager on Sepp Straka. And Sepp Straka did help me a lot in DFS. Harris English played well. Luke List, I was incorrect on a few players, so I wasn't all positive. I was wrong on Jordan Spieth. Was nowhere near Ben on myself. So congratulations to Mom. I hit a top or a top European, if you will, or a placement wager. And if you had success, please let me know in the comments. Reach out to me on social media. If you're watching live, reach or put it in chat. Let me know what success you had this week for the Tournament of Champions or the Century at Kapalua. And we're going to move on to the first full field event of the calendar year of the new PGA Tour season. We are at the usual second spot in the calendar year at Waialae Golf Course in Honolulu. I am quite excited after starting the year off right, so let's get into it. All statistics provided tonight and every night are from fantasynational.com. It is the best tool out there for your money. It's going to make you a much smarter golf gambler and a much better golf DFS player. With Fantasy National, you're not going to have to listen to me. You're going to be able to make your own statistical analysis, your own wagers, and all of that. Have all of the data at your fingertips. So go check out Fantasy National. You won't regret it. In the description to the video, there are links to all of the social media. First off, my X and Instagram, where I post research every week around the PGA Tour that will be coming out tomorrow around previous winners of the Sony, perhaps some useful course information, anything of that like. So if you want to see the weekly research I do on the PGA Tour, then give me a follow over at your preferred social media site. X is also where I place my aforementioned betting cards, where you would have seen my not so good outright wagers and my winning wager on Sepp Straka this past week. But my betting cards and my weekly or my player exposure every week for the DFS slate. I post both of those on Wednesday evening on X. So if you want to see that, give me a follow over there. And then lastly, for social media, Gabe's X handle is in the description. He writes a very good article called The Fringe that did continue this week as he sent out his version, his opening preview of the Sony Open. So go show Gabe some support. Subscribe to that article. It is free to do so, because if you do subscribe to that article, you're going to be able to join us in his Substack chat every Wednesday evening as we continue the DFS talk after calls. So you don't want to miss that. And I know that is going to start up again this week. And then lastly, we're live. Chat's open. Again, if you had winning wagers, if you had Chris Kirk, that's a heck of an outright. Let us know in the community. Let me know. But jump in chat. How was your Tournament of Champions or your Century? Who did you find yourself pulling for? Any good wagers? Any mistakes that you made? And then what are you looking forward to this week for the Sony Open at Waialae? Still in Hawaii, but a much, much different course than Kapalua. So what are you looking forward to in that regard? And then the last update that I have for you all very quickly, or the last bit of this intro before we get into the show proper, make note of your calendar, your reminders for this week. The Wednesday night's DFS Tactics show will be moved to 10 p.m. Eastern time. Just no way around it. I am in a wiffle ball league. My game is scheduled at 8:30. Can't move that around. So 10 o'clock this Wednesday for the DFS Tactics show. But won't be too terribly late, and especially with a very late start as the players are still in Hawaii. It still gives us plenty of time to look at what we need to for the Sony. So speaking of, let's do our initial research for the 2024 Sony Open. And we're going to start over at the GCSAA tournament fact sheet with a slight caveat in that this is last year's tournament fact sheet. Wildeye has not changed, not that I know of, and of course we will update this tomorrow if need be. But this year's tournament fact sheet is not out yet, and don't mind the shirt. I am repping a little bit of fandom since they won and clinched the playoff spot, so I figured I would let my fandom show out a little bit tonight, as today has just been a good day. The wager on Sepp Straka hit. Obviously the Packers win and get into the playoffs. It's just been a good day. So hopefully you have shared in that success. We are at Waialae Country Club this week for the Sony Open, the only host of the Sony Open since its inception in 1965. You can see that just to the left of me there. Waialae is a very, very short course. Par 70 measures just over 7,000 yards at 7,044. A couple of other notes here. This is originally a Seth Rayner design. What has been renovated a couple of times in the past. Robert Trent Jones, most recently Tom Doak, who has a couple of, or his hands on a couple of courses throughout the PGA Tour. But it is originally a Seth Rayner design. Very short course. Now the stimp is somewhat important to see here. Just like Kapalua last year, when those greens got listed at average, these greens have been sped up recently in the past couple of years. So it would not surprise me to see some fast readings this week. So the stimp is listed at 11 to 12. That would be on the average to maybe fast end. Some other notes about Waialae. Average green size. These are still very large greens. Not as large as Kapalua. Kapalua is the largest on the PGA Tour. But these are still very large greens at 7,100 square feet on average. Quite a bit of fairway, even though this is such a short course. Quite a bit of fairway, so a very forgiving course in that regard. But there is a lot of rough because there's not a lot of water in play. You have 5 holes with water in play. A few bunkers, I'd say probably about an average amount. And we are on Bermuda grass again. The difference is I went and I tried to look at all of the previous Sony Opens tournament fact sheets. Reached out to Gabe. I've tried to find as much information as I can. Anything that I have seen has just listed Bermuda. No specific type of Bermuda, whether that's Tiff Eagle like we were on last week at Kapalua, Tiff Dwarf, Champion. I'm not sure what exact Bermuda surface this is other than just Bermuda grass. Gabe didn't have that information as well. So we're just going to be looking at Bermuda this week, and hopefully we're going to be able to find some more exact information. But as of now, we're just going to be looking at Bermuda greens, and we are on Bermuda throughout the entirety of the course, just like we were at Kapalua. Fairways, rough, greens, all Bermuda. We just don't know what exact type of Bermuda on the greens. But again, Waialae, biggest takeaways, it's a par 70. So again, another big difference from Kapalua, which is a par 73. Only 2 par 5s at Waialae as opposed to 4 at Kapalua. Very short course, 7,044 yards. The greens have been sped up in recent years. Large greens, and they are Bermuda. So with that, we will move to Fantasy National. And as of, I would say, roughly around lunchtime today, that's going to be the best estimate I can give you all. I have not seen any field withdrawals yet. Rob Bolton over on X would be the best source of information there. So if you are keen to see if anyone has withdrawn already, I would suggest go looking there. But with that being the case, again, just looking at the past calendar year, and of course with the Sony having finished up maybe about an hour and a half ago, or I said the Sony, with the Century finishing up about an hour and a half ago. The Century's not in here yet. But your top performers last calendar year in 2023 that have committed originally or initially to play in the Sony this week: Ludwig Aubert, Eric Cole, who had a monster charge today at the Century, Lucas Glover, Russell Henley, JT Poston, another very solid performance, Brian Harmon, a solid performance at the Century. Cam Davis, Terrell Hatton, Luke List, and Stefan Jaeger are your top 10 in terms of performance in 2023. The runner-up at the Century, Sahith Theegala, is here. Quite a few other Century players or Century tournament participants: Brendan Todd, Justin Rose, who shot a 61 today. I'm not sure if many people knew that or know of that. He did shoot a 61 today. He went extremely low. He just had a very poor start to his tournament, so he was pretty well out of it from the get-go. Connors is here, English, Andrew Putnam. Quite a few of the players that played at the Century have committed initially to playing the Sony. So one of the first things we would like to do, again, because of the GCSAA tournament fact sheet, we can take a look at performance on short courses. Waialae, just over 7,000 yards, easily falls into that short course criteria per Fantasy National. So last year alone, in 2023, your top performers on short courses: Russell Henley, Eric Cole, Ludwig Aubert, Justin Rose, Chris Kirk, Ben On, Denny McCarthy, Brendan Todd, Brian Harmon, and Taylor Montgomery. So before we go too much further, and we're going to look at a few things here in the page view, or the player page view. Let's take a look at the course breakdown here in Fantasy National. Get a scorecard and graphical look at Waialae. Much like Kapalua, there are a couple of holes that can come up and get you that are pretty tough here at Waialae. Particularly the long par 4 13th plays to a quarter of a shot over par. You see only a 7% birdie rate, 27% bogeys. It's just a very difficult hole at Waialae. Plays to a quarter of a shot over par. But you quickly get into the area where we were at Kapalua. 1/10 over, 1/10 over, 1300ths over. One very difficult hole, followed by a few holes that can play tough if you are out of position. Whereas you look at the two par 5s here, the par 5 9th, 506 yards. I mean, you had several par 4s that were longer than that at Kapalua. Plays to 2/3 of a shot under par. An eagle rate of 6.5%. That's astronomically high. You see birdies at 60%, just a very easy golf hole for professionals. Par 5 18th. Also pretty short at 551. Plays to a half a shot under par. So you got two holes there that are counteracting this very difficult hole. Very, very much so. But after that, the scoring gets to be right around par. 1600ths, 600ths, 700ths. So players really, really take advantage of those two par 5s. And then the rest of the course plays to kind of about par, maybe a little bit less, as we'll see. You see par right here on the 11th most difficult. So would tend to signify a little bit on the easy side, a little bit. But we'll see that for whatever reason, maybe it's these par fives combined with the par 4 10th here. You do get a few rounds that are quite easy here, but we'll get into that. Moving on down into strokes gained by shot type, similar to the winners of Kapalua, putting is actually dominating, or I say dominating, is the leading factor for players in the top 10 here at Waialae. Putting and then approach off the tee and around the green. So it's a pretty even split here with short game and ball striking. Short game is slightly outweighing ball striking due to the putting. Moving to the top fives, it's just starting to get a little bit more exacerbated with the putting and the approach. And then for the winners, as you would expect, winners are going to be making a lot of putts. The off the tee does start to pull away from the around the green for the winners. And the approach does rise a decent amount too, but you can see just how much the putting is. So we're looking at a very similar course that we were for Kapalua, in the sense that we're going to be wanting to look at a lot of putting, especially for the top 10s, 5s, and winners. Approach is not going away. You're still going to have to be good with your irons. And then for the winners, off the tee might be something. And we'll dig into a lot of that data, especially tomorrow. But there's a look at your strokes gained by shot type. Average strokes gained by hole by par. You would expect the 2 par 5s are dominating here. Even though there's only 2 of them, they're so easy that players are gaining a lot of strokes, relative to par. And if you are parring these holes, you are losing some significant amount of ground to the rest of the field. So even though this is a par 70, with only 2 par 5s, the par 5s are still outweighing. It's surprising to see how little the par 3s are, at least for the top 10s. Moving to the top 5s, par 3s might start trying to catch up, and in fact the par 5s start to lengthen themselves away from the par 4s. And then for the winners, it's more the same really. The par 3s do gain a lot for the winners, but it's fairly consistent here throughout the winners, your top 5s and your top 10s. Par 5s, you've just got to play those 2 holes well during the week. Par 4s do gain some significance as you rise up the leaderboard as well. So moving down to hole composition, 3 of your 4 par 3s fall from 175 to 200, at least on the scorecard, with 1 being 200 to 225. So we'll see, especially again tomorrow, if that is a significant or maybe all of where our focus on the par 3s are going to go. Par 4s, you do have 2 short. One I will say is semi-drivable, depending on how aggressive you really want to be, and wind, which I will remember to do tomorrow. Wind does play a pretty big factor at Waialae. If it's blowing pretty hard, Waialae can get pretty tough. 2 short par 4s, 1 may be drivable in the right conditions and the biggest of hitters, but 2 short par 4s. The rest of the par 4s are very, very short generally. 5 from 400 to 450, 5 from 450 to 500. And really, one of the longest ones is the toughest, the par 4 13th at 477. Look at the rest of these par 4s that are falling in that range, 454, 460. Now, you do have a 467 and a 480 that's not going to threaten to come into this lower bucket, but even a couple of these 450 to 500s will find themselves in this shorter bucket. And then the 2 par 5s are evenly split, 1 very short at 506 on the scorecard, 1 at 551, which you can easily see falling into this range bucket as well. So generally on the shorter ends of the spectrum in regards to especially the par 4s and the par 5s here at Waialae. Now the par 3s are pretty consistent in that 175 to about 210 range. You got a 194, 194, 176 is very short, and then 204, which that one can get stretched out a little bit. So there's a look at your whole composition. We'll see tomorrow as we look at this into some specific Waialae data and and some prior leaderboards if there are certain ranges we want to focus on. Approach shot distribution, even though this is a short course, there are a lot of forced layups off the tees, or players choose to take 3 woods or longer irons to keep themselves in the fairways. So a lot of your approach shots will come from 150 to 175, despite the relative lack of length in this course. You do have a few from 175 to 200 as well, again, due to that the nature of those forced layups on some of these tees. So we'll see, again, tomorrow, if there's a specific range of proximity, which one in the players that we want to focus on. But just for your initial look this evening, you'll probably want to be looking at some 150 to 175, perhaps some 175 to 200 as well in terms of proximity. Historic cut line, speaking to the relative ease of the Sony Open and while you see the trend has gone down since the mid-2000s. It's been as high as +4, generally doesn't get to there. You might get, every once in a while you'll get to maybe par or +1, but the majority of these cut lines are under par. Last year was at -1, did get all the way down to -4 2 years ago, but the wind was essentially non-existent 2 years ago, which led to a lot of low scores. I would expect something around the -2 range, -1, -2, which would put it into the average category, but on the easier end of average in terms of difficulty. That's generally how the Sony plays. With the scoring distribution, almost 20% birdies. You have almost 15% bogeys, a few doubles, thanks to a couple of holes here, particularly the aforementioned 13th, plays to a quarter of a shot. And then the beginning of Waialae is fairly tough. Fairly long par 4, 480, hole number 1. Par 4 second, 423. 460, par 4 sixth. Can play a little bit difficult, so there's where some of your bogeys and perhaps some doubles come in. But you still stack up the under par scores and put them up against the over par scores. You're going to have more scores under than over. Still going to play relatively easy. Driving accuracy, despite some of the forced layup nature of some of these holes, the rough is just not difficult to play out of here. So players generally try to push their limits on distance as much as possible. We'll see that in a chart a little bit lower. So driving accuracy here, 53% versus 62% at the average tour event. Despite the size of the greens are only slightly hit more in regulation here, 66.5 to 65.5 or so percent green regulation percentage. And because that rough is not very difficult to play out of, scrambling is quite a bit easier here than the average tour event. 60% successful scrambling percentage versus about 57.5. 3 putts per round, whether that is getting used to Bermuda again or shaking the rust off if most of the players play the Century, maybe just the greens aren't as large as Kapalua for whatever reason. 3 putts aren't as common as the average tour event. Only about a half a 3 putt per round versus about 50 or 0.55. And then, as I was mentioning earlier, driving distance. Players generally push it here as much as they can. There are, again, a couple holes that you do have to are forced layups. But distance, 286 here versus about 283 at the average tour event. Green regulation proximity, about a half a foot shorter or a half a foot closer. So with that, now we've got a decent feel for Waialae in terms of a graphical view, scorecard view, perhaps some shot types and distances that we want to look at. Again, this is my preferred. I'm always going to be a strokes gained approach preferred player. It's just the metric that I feel is the most consistent on the PGA Tour. It lends itself to the most consistency in the long term. So our top strokes gained approach players, the last 36 rounds minus the Century of this past week. Last 36 rounds in 2023, our top Approach players in the field this week: Lucas Glover, Hideki, Russell Henley, Eric Cole, Gary Woodland, Mark Hubbard, Alex Smalley, Justin Rose, Aaron Rye, and JT Poston. Not to overlook the off the tee. Definitely, we saw the winners. The off the tee had a decent, significant factor. Our top off the tee players in the field this week: Obear, Ben On, Garrick Higo, Kevin Yu, Doug Gim, Keith Mitchell, Luke List, Tyler Duncan, Vincent Norman, and Johnny Vegas. Then lastly, let's take a look at some Bermuda greens. So I will put on the Bermuda green filter here. Before I look at speed, as I was mentioning, these greens have been sped up in recent years. So in 2022, they had 3 of the 4 rounds played a fast. Every single round played the fast last year. With that said, though, those were the first 2 years that YLI had fast rated greens. So because of that, I am still going to include the average speed filter. So we're going to look at average and fast speed Bermuda greens. But we're including the fast because it is starting to be more consistently fast here at YLI, at least the past 2 years. So on fast and average Bermuda greens, and this is there again, there's no specific Bermuda type, TIFF Eagle, TIFF Dwarf, Champion. We don't have that information, at least the GCSIA didn't have that information. I looked this weekend, didn't see any specific information around YLI. So we're just going to be looking at all Bermuda on fast and average speed greens, and we're going to take a look here. Most players have, into the upward teens, into the 20s. In terms of amount of rounds, that's going to be plenty, at least to get an initial look. So our top putters on fast and average speed Bermuda greens in 2023: Matt Kuchar, Alex Noren, Andrew Putnam, Justin Suh, Ben Griffin, Billy Horschel, Maverick McNeely, Ben Taylor, Brendan Todd, and Dylan Wu. All right. The only other thing we're going to look at in terms of a high-level view is we'll take a look at par 5s. I mean, you just have to play these 2 par 5s extremely well. Now, my guess is we're going to be looking at probably just the 0 to 500. But we're going to take a look at all par 5s for the evening just to get a nice high-level view before we get into any specific data tomorrow, before we move on with any further into the show. So our top par 5 performers in the field this week, the last 36 rounds: Aaron Rye, Stefan Jaeger, Davis Thompson, Cam Davis, Eric Van Rooyen, Matty Schmid, JJ Spawn, Ludwig Obear, Siwoo Kim, and Taylor Pendrith. All right, so next thing we're going to do, and the last thing we're going to do in Fantasy National, let's take a look at the tournament history. Strokes gained total tab, if you will. These are the players who have played the Sony Open the best in the past 5 years. So our defending champion, Siwoo Kim, you see that there. Hideki won in 2022. Cam Smith wins in 2021. You see Matt Kuchar won in 2019. 2020, the champion's not here. So several past champions, at least in the last 5 years, are here. Jimmy Walker in the mid-2010s, I believe 13 and 14, or maybe 14 and 15, back-to-back champion. I'm trying to think of a few other names here. Kevin Na, a past winner here. So not Justin Thomas is a previous winner here. So not one specific way to get around YLI. I mean, Kevin Na not the longest of hitters. Siwoo Kim's not necessarily long. Hideki is fairly long. Justin Thomas long. Kuchar's not. Kuchar's more of a putter and short game player. But one of the thing that sticks out with all of these guys is that their irons are generally pretty solid, and they were very solid, at least in form, coming into that week. So in the past 5 years, the top performers at YLI, speaking of irons, you've got Corey Connors, who doesn't have necessarily the upper end success, except for maybe a T3 in 2019. He's just been very consistent and very good. 3 top 15 finishes, and then a T3 in 2019. So he's been very good here. Matt Kuchar has been all or nothing. A win, two more top 10s, but has missed the cut in 20 and 2021. So he's been all or nothing. Hideki, not necessarily all or nothing, but a win, top 20, top 15, and then some middling to clunkers. Chris Kirk, your winner this week at Kapalua, has played very well the last 3 years. He did miss the cut in 2020 and 2019. Some other players here who have had consistent amounts of success: Ryan Palmer, Andrew Putnam, Russell Henley, Stuart Sink, Kevin Kisner, 4 for 4 in the past 5 years. One really bad finish, at least in terms of making a cut, but a T3 and a T4. Hayden Buckley has been very, very good in his 2 trips here. A solo second, and a T12. Some other names here: Keith Mitchell, much more in the all or nothing like Matt Kuchar. 3 for 5, 3 great finishes and 2 missed cuts. Of course, Siwoo. This is kind of what Siwoo does. He can be inconsistent, but then will pop and win. So he's been fairly good here. Webb, Nick Taylor. At the other end of the spectrum, players who have not played the Sony Open well for whatever reason. Mark Hubbard, 1 for 4. Tyler Duncan, 1 for 4. Luke List, 0 for 2. Not a big surprise here, especially considering that putting seems to be another dominating force, and he's generally not a good putter. I'll be interested to see what his putting stats were for the Century. Michael Kim, 1 for 3. Nate Lashley, 2 for 4. He did top 10 last year, but nothing inspiring other than that. Troy Merritt, 2 for 4. Zach Johnson, 3 for 5, but again, just nothing inspiring in terms of finishes. Takumi Kanaya, 0 for 3. Alex Smalley, Brandon Wu, 0 for 2 each. Spawn, only 1 for 4. So there's a few of the players that have not played well here at YLI the past 5 years. Now that's a good segue. Well, as we move over to Microsoft Excel, let's take a look at YLI and compare it to other full field courses on the PGA Tour. And because the Sony has traditionally been a full field event, been able to gather stats and have been used in those aggregations or those data summaries. So against other full field courses, you see irons, slightly less important, off the tee quite a bit. So I imagine for the winners, this number would change. But in terms of just in the aggregate, it's all about kind of the putting here. 8% more important for the players that finish in the top 30 here at YLI. So another week where we're going to be looking at putting. Approach, definitely not going to be ignored. Might look at some off the tee, but I'm going to feel more comfortable after we dig into some data tomorrow about that. Moving into driving and greens. Another situation here where I don't see a whole lot in this page view unless something sticks out tomorrow. Distance really isn't that much of a factor here because most players are kind of pushing it anyway. Whereas Kapalua was a little bit different, that everybody was going to get distance just due to the design of the course, the undulation and whatnot. Here at YLI, players just kind of push it to their limits because they know the rough's not penal. Fairways, not so much, even though driving accuracy over on Fantasy National said that this was less than the average tour course. It's more so that the players, again, just aren't worried about being in the rough. So no on the fairways, and the greens are slightly less. And that makes a lot of sense because these greens are fairly significantly larger than the average PGA Tour green in terms of size. So maybe greens in regulation might be something, but at least in initial thought, it doesn't it doesn't feel like greens are going to be that important, and then good drives neither. So we move into scoring, and it's actually fairly consistent between birdies and bogeys. And as I mentioned at Kapalua, how we looked at bogey avoidance as part of our mixed condition model. We'll go through the prior leaderboards tomorrow for the Sony and see if birdies or bogeys tend to either be the more consistent metric or one that stands out a little bit more. But at least in terms of raw data, looking like they're pretty darn consistent. You see the Eagles are actually above as well, 6%, and that's due to the fact that especially that par 5 ninth is so darn easy. Yields an eagle at 6.5%. Are we going to want to look at eagles by themselves because of that one hole? I doubt it, but it is something to consider. Moving into pars 3s, 4s, and 5s, which I made this note while we were going through it. Par 3s, I was a little surprised, especially for the top 10s, but you see for the top 30s, par 3s just aren't having a big factor here at all. Not at all. 31% less important than the average full field course. Now, the range that has 3 of the 4 par 3s, you see, are garnering more importance than the average full field course. So that's not a surprise there. We'll go into a lot more detail tomorrow, but my initial thought seems to be we're going to want to focus on just the 175 to 200. Moving into the par 4s, this was a little bit hidden in those graphs, but the par 4s are actually 17% more important. This course is actually one of the most important par 4 courses there is on the PGA Tour. You see in the fall, the traditional Mayakoba, El Camaleon, fairly important. And then we move down further, the Wells Fargo, 21%. There's the Travelers, TPC River Highlands is at 17% as well. The Sony, Waialae, really emphasizes these par 4s. Really emphasizes these par 4s. And look at the 2 ranges that have 5 each that fall into those range buckets. Those are the 2 that are over average in terms of against the average full field course. So we're going to be looking at a lot of par 4s, I think, this week. Looking at a lot of the par 4s this week. And that's what I feel is like a hidden aspect of Waialae. And if you think about it, it does make sense. With only 2 par 5s, it means you have 12 par 4s. They tend to make up a lot of the scoring here. And then for your par 5s, 1 in each of these buckets. And you see that the 0 to 500 is fairly significant. That's because I would imagine this one being at 552 or whatever it is probably plays into this one more often than not. So this could be a situation where we're looking at a specific length of par 5 as well. Lastly, comparing Waialae to other full field courses, prox total, 25% more important. And then the 2 ranges, especially at that 175 to 200 mark, 87% more important. So I will be interested to look at the prior leaderboards in terms of proximity tomorrow. But there's a look at Waialae compared to other courses. And then tomorrow we'll do the customary look in terms of the raw data of Waialae. But there's a look at Waialae in terms of compared against other full field courses. Good morning, Drew. Good evening. I guess good morning in your area of the world, but good evening. Thanks for jumping into chat. I know I mentioned I was going to try to do some gaming streams. I tried, and the stream crashed. So I don't know if I need to change my settings or what. I just haven't looked into that. But the intent was there, and the stream crashed when I tried to do that I guess that was last Saturday evening? Friday or Saturday evening. But thanks for jumping in chat and checking out some more golf content. Much appreciated. We move to the final part of the show, we'll take a look at the early look file. And this is performance specifically at YLI for the players in the field this week. How many times they've played this event in the past 5 years. Their average finish, how many times they've missed the cut. So you see quite a few players up here that have only played it one time. I want to remove those players because I do want to get a, oh gosh dang it, I need to highlight that entire thing. I do want to get a feel for the players who have played this often. I will leave in the player, no, that is not what I wanted. I wanted the other way around. I'll have to check that one. We might need to remove the players who have only played it twice, but in terms of players who have played YLI multiple years in the past 5, let's get a feel for what they have done well, and that way we might get a sense leading into our research tomorrow what we're wanting to focus on and what plays well at YLI. So you see here, Hayden Buckley has been doing it mostly in the ball striking, a little bit in terms of the putting. If we look at players who have averaged, let's say a top 40, that's 19 players. That's decent sample size here. Varying degrees of success, obviously. You have Kuchar's a former winner, a couple other top 10s, and then missed the cut, versus somebody, say like Corey Connors, who's just been very consistent. If we look at players who have averaged a top 40, as long as they've played it multiple years in the past 5 and averaged top 40, you have a 1.1 here and off the tee. Really, that's actually probably a little bit higher. Really, Andrew Putnam, which off the tee is not his game anyway. You remove that Andrew Putnam figure, that's probably going to rise a little bit. 1.3. So off the tee might have a little bit of something here. You see the heavy green here in terms of approach. This is a 1.7. Lots of players who have been very good with their irons, specifically at YLI, and who have had good track records of success. Around the green doesn't look like much. This is a 0.4. And then putting is a 1.6. So putting and approach, again, which we saw graphically, you really only have one player that's significantly negative, and that's Andrew Novak. He's been very good around the green, but he's been pretty bad on the greens. He's really the only player that's significantly bad on the greens. Look at everybody else. Hideki's a little bit low as well. I won't highlight him. Everybody else here that's averaged the top 40, other than Hideki and Andrew Novak, relatively close or above field average in terms of putting. So this looks like it's going to be another week where we're going to want to put a decent amount of emphasis on putting this week. So take a look at your Bermuda putters, fast, average speed Bermuda putters. If we happen to find the specific Bermuda type, whether that's TIFF Dwarf, Champion, whatever. But we're going to have some emphasis on putting again this week. We move to distance, greens. Distance, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot here. We've got some pretty high negatives and not preventing players from playing well. Really, the highest I see here is Lonto Griffin. That's only a 49. So it doesn't appear that many players are gaining much in terms of distance. Really kind of the same with fairways, except for maybe Hayden Buckley, who seems like he's just trying to hitting every single fairway. I mean, Griffin's not doing it, and he's played decently. Stuart Sink's played fairly well here, not hitting a lot of fairways. Joseph Bramlett, a little bit less in terms of success, but not finding a lot of fairways, but he's been okay. So I'm not seeing a whole lot here in terms of fairways. Now, greens could be a little bit different. We got one player that's pretty negative, pretty far negative in terms of Brendan Todd. Everybody else here is pretty darn good. This is a 2.0. That's decent. So maybe greens is kind of another one of these hidden aspects of YLI, like the par fours, perhaps greens in regulation. Let's take a look at scoring. I am interested in seeing this, since at least in terms of averages for top 30, the birdies and the bogeys were pretty similar. So if we look at the players that we've been focused on, these players who have averaged top 40, this is a 1.7, pretty high up here and then kind of falls off. So 1.7 versus a 2.1 for the bogeys avoided. So this could be another situation kind of like last week, where the higher numbers are in the birdies, but the more consistency is in the bogeys. Because in fact, look at this. Just like last week at Kapalua, every single player who has played the Sony multiple times in the past 5 years is positive in terms of bogey avoidance if they're averaging a top 40 or better. That's pretty solid correlation there. Pretty solid. Every single player who has played YLI multiple years in the past 5 years is positive in bogey avoidance if they're averaging a top 40. It's pretty strong. It's pretty strong. Moving to the par threes, my guess is that the majority is going to come into here. But if we look at par threes, fours, and fives in general, threes here, that's a 0.8. Par fours, a 3.3, so 4 times the importance or strokes gained in the par fours than the par threes. And something else that I just noticed, look at the players again. The players who have averaged the top 40, not a single one of them, not a single one is negative in par fours either. Another probably hidden aspect of YLI. And then par fives is a 0.7. So really, the players who have played YLI the best are actually gaining more in the par threes. That doesn't seem great. That seems a little counterintuitive to what we've seen before. But there's no denying the fact that par fours are carrying a whole lot of weight here. And you can see that with these past performances of the players who have played YLI the best. All right, last thing this evening, if we can find something in these proximities, I highly doubt we will. And there's some decent good numbers in here. Like McNeely's not great, but some of these numbers are decent. But the 150 to 175, that doesn't look good at all. 175 to 200 doesn't really look good at all either. So that's why I always like to go through the prior leaderboards and figure out if there's a range. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe it's total procs. Maybe the prior leaderboards will help us see 175 to 200 is. And the years that these players don't play necessarily as well, their proximity performance that year is bad. So we'll see. But nothing stands out in terms of the players who have played YLI the best with proximity. Looking like it's a lot in the par fours, as you can see there. Quite a bit in the bogey avoidance, actually. There. And the putting, which we knew coming into that. But that's going to be it for the show this evening. I want to thank Drew for jumping in chat. I want to thank everyone else out there who tunes in, watches, listens, supports the channel by liking the videos, commenting, subscribing. Always appreciate it. We've gotten 2024 off with a bang. Hit the Sepp Straka Top European. It's not as flashy as saying having the outright win, but I will not complain about having a positive week starting off 2024 well in that regard. We're going to see if we can continue the momentum. And a reminder that Wednesday evening, the DFS Tactics show is going to be at 10 p.m., not 9, 10 p.m. Due to some scheduling conflicts. So mark your calendars with that. But let me know over on social media in the comments of the show how you did this week at the Kapalua and what you're thinking for the Sony. Thanks again for the support. For all the wagers you made this past week at the Century, for all the DFS contests you played this past week at the Century, and until I see you tomorrow night for the Data Dive show, may all your bets be profitable.